I'm Misty, the Tudor Yank, and today we're going to explore York. Most cities age, but this one accumulates. You don't arrive in York and start at the beginning, because there isn't one. There's layers. Roman, Viking, medieval, all still active and all still visible. Today we're going to be moving through the streets that predate most modern nations. It takes about 2 hours from London to arrive in York. You leave glass in motion and arrive somewhere that never fully updated. York Station opened in 1877 and was one of the largest in the world at the time. This was a railway hub where industry moved through at one point, and today you just step off the train. But first, let's check into our hotel for our stay in York. We're going to be at the Milner, York, and it's right next to the station. I don't mean nearby and I don't mean just convenient. I mean it is right behind the station. And that was very intentional. The hotel originally opened in 1878 as part of the Northeastern Railway Hotel. It was indeed built by the railway company itself. Because if you can control transport, you could probably control where people stayed. And that's not just an accommodation, that's part of the infrastructure. The passengers arrived and were immediately absorbed into the system. No need to navigate the city and no need to leave the network. Where you're going to stay is right here. Now, Victorian railway companies weren't subtle. They built to scale and they built to impress. But most of all, they built things to last longer than their competition. Inside, the proportions still hold. High ceilings, wide corridors, spaces designed for movement. Now, the hotel has changed names over the years and the ownership has shifted a few times, but the purpose never really did. It remains tied to the station, tied to movement, and tied to the idea that York was a place that you passed through or paused in. But the city wasn't built for passing through. Now let's go and explore York. Now to the York City walls, the longest surviving medieval city walls in England. The story actually begins with the Romans because almost everything in Britain eventually does. Around 71 AD, Roman soldiers built a fortress here called Eboracum, and they surrounded it with defensive walls made of earth and timber, practical, efficient, and very Roman. The Romans loved straight lines, engineering, and reminding everyone who was in charge. Later, those temporary defenses were rebuilt in stone, creating a permanent boundary around one of the most important Roman cities in northern Britain. At one point, around 6,000 soldiers were stationed here, which meant York was less of a town and more of a heavily armed reminder of imperial authority. After the Romans left Britain in the early 5th century, the walls didn't just disappear because good infrastructure is hard to quit. Successive groups reused and repaired them. The Anglo-Saxons lived here, and then the Vikings arrived in the 9th century and renamed the city to Jorvik, proving once again that conquering somewhere else is easier if you just slightly rebrand it. The walls remained vital because if you controlled York, you controlled northern England, and historically a lot of people wanted that job. The walls you see today, though, are mostly medieval, built between the 12th and 14th century. This was a time when cities invested heavily into defense, partly because warfare was common and partly because these walls were excellent status symbols. A strong wall said your city was wealthy, organized, and worth attacking, which was both reassuring and slightly counterproductive. The walls stretch roughly 2 miles around the city and include gates known as bars. Not bars as in serving drinks, though medieval soldiers probably would have appreciated that, but it's from the Old English word for barrier. Each bar controlled access to York. There's Micklegate Bar, traditionally used by monarchs entering the city. There's Bootham Bar, guarding the northern road. Monk Bar, the tallest and most fortified gatehouse. And Walmgate Bar. Entering York in the Middle Ages was not casual. The gates were locked at night, the guards checked travelers, and taxes could be collected on goods entering the city. So the walls weren't just military structures, they were customs checkpoints, they were security systems, and economic control all rolled into stone. Medieval urban planning was surprisingly efficient, assuming you didn't mind surveillance and the occasional siege. And York did see conflict. During the English Civil War of the 1640s, the city was besieged by parliamentary forces. The walls played a crucial defensive role, holding back attackers for months. Cannons fired, soldiers clashed, supplies ran low, but eventually York surrendered. Gunpowder, it turned out, was very bad for medieval architecture. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the city walls across Britain were often demolished to allow for the expansion of traffic. Walls were seen as outdated obstacles and inconvenient reminders of a less efficient past. York almost lost theirs too, but something unusual happened. People decided to keep them. The history enthusiasts of the Georgian and Victorian eras realized these walls were extraordinary signs of survival. Instead of tearing them down, York preserved them. Which is why today you can casually walk along the defenses that once were designed to repel invading armies while holding your coffee. Walking these walls now gives you a strange perspective. On one side, medieval streets, towers, and centuries of history. On the other, modern shops, buses, and people checking their phones. The walls don't separate enemies anymore, they separate time periods. Each step is literally a walk along the layers of history. Roman foundations supporting medieval ambition, preserved by Victorian nostalgia, and maintained by modern tourism. It's less of a structure and more of a timeline you can stroll across. And maybe that's why York's walls feel different from other ruins. They're not isolated monuments, they're still part of daily life. The walls survived because the city adapted around them instead of replacing them, which is a very rare historical outcome. Usually, progress demolishes the past, but in here, progress installed handrails. So the York City walls stand as nearly 2,000 years of continuous urban defense, evolving from Roman military engineering into one of Britain's best preserved medieval landmarks. They were built to divide, defend, and control. Now they connect viewpoints, histories, and people. Proof that sometimes the strongest structures aren't the ones that resist change, but the ones that survive long enough to mean something new. This is the National Railway Museum, which is less about trains and more about how the British accidentally rewired the entire planet using steam, metal, and a very aggressive timetable. Before railways, distance was a bit of a problem. Travel was slow and expensive and notoriously unreliable. Moving goods meant horses, carts, and a lot of patience. Then the 19th century happens, and patience is no longer required. The railway changes everything. Speed increases and costs drop. Cities expanded and trade explodes. And for the first time in history, people, goods, and ideas move faster than the landscape they're moving through. And Britain led this. Not by a little, but by a lot. The world's first public railway using the steam locomotive opens in 1829. The Stockton and Darlington Railway, which sounds local, but it wasn't. It was the start of something global. Locomotives like Stephenson's rocket pushed things further. Faster speeds and better engineering. And then suddenly, railways weren't experimental. They were essential. And then you get to icons like the Leonard class A4 4468 Mallard, built in 1938. And might be surprised to know, still holds the world speed record for a steam locomotive at 126 miles per hour, which for something powered by boiling water seems frankly unreasonable. But it's not just about speed here, it's also about scale. Railways standardize time, and quite literally. Before trains, towns kept their own local time based on the sun. After trains, that stops, because trains need schedules, and schedules need agreement. So railway time becomes national time, which means that watch you're wearing right now is indirectly set by trains. And then there's industry, coal, steel, and manufacturing. Railways connected all of it, from raw materials in to finished goods out, faster than ever before. Cities grow because of this, not gradually, but rapidly. Workers can travel further and goods can be distributed in a wider area. Urban life scales up at a pace that would have looked impossible just decades earlier. And Britain then exports this entire system around the world, to Europe, to India, and North America, even though it tries to keep up. The railway becomes the backbone of the industrial world, and that all started here. Inside this museum, you're seeing not just engineering, but you're seeing infrastructure. The physical system that allowed modern economies to function at a scale. And that's also deeply human, because railways don't just move goods, they also move people. They move commuters, soldiers, and whole families. Entire populations shifting in ways that were never possible before. Which means the railways didn't just change economies, they also changed society by changing where you could live, where you could work, and who you could interact with. And over time, steam gives way to diesel. Then diesel gives way to electric, but the system stays, just more refined, a little more expanded, and modernized. Still doing the same job, just faster, cleaner, and quieter. So this just isn't a collection of old trains. It's a record of a turning point. The moment that distance stopped being a barrier and simply became something you could schedule around. And once that happened, everything and everyone else starts moving with it. This is the ye olde Starre, which looks like a pub because it is a pub. But more importantly, it's one of York's oldest pubs, which in York is kind of saying something. There's been a pub in this exact site since at least 1644, right in the middle of the English Civil War, where you really need a pub. Royalists, parliamentarians, both sides fighting for control over the country, and presumably stopping here for a pint. And that matters because York was a bit of a royalist stronghold, meaning the city backed the king, which also meant it got besieged. Cannons, fighting, and political chaos. But somewhere in the middle of that, this place was still serving ale. Because that's what pubs are, a constant. Government changes, war happens, empires rise and fall. And the pub just continues, pouring drinks through all of it. Now, just down the street, you see the birthplace of Guy Fawkes, which kind of feels on brand. Political tension and religious conflict, and a building full of people discussing it loudly over alcohol. So this isn't just somewhere to get a drink, it's part of the social infrastructure. It's where news spread and deals were made. Arguments happened, and occasionally, history was shaped slightly more informally than intended. This is the River Ouse, which looks calm and relaxing, and occasionally it decides to flood the city just to remind everyone who's actually in charge. Now, York exists here because of this river. It allowed for trade and transport and settlement. If you wanted a functioning city in early England, you had to build it near water, and preferably water that could move things and occasionally threaten the other side. The Romans, they knew this. When they founded York in 71 AD as Iberacum, they chose this exact spot for that exact reason. It was defensible, connected, and very practical. And hey, look, it's my family's name, Yates. Everything a growing empire could possibly need. And that pattern never really changes through history. The Vikings used it, medieval merchants used it. Goods were in and out on this very river, and the river was quietly doing most of the work. Because before railways, before roads as we know them, this was infrastructure. Heavy cargo travels easier by water, and it was cheaper and more efficient to do so. Which means if you could control that river, you could control that economy. But rivers, they're not predictable, and the Ouse has a habit of reminding York of that. Flooding here is not rare, it's expected, and water levels rise, and the streets just kind of disappear. But life adjusts. And you can still see the markers of high water lines with dates carved into some of the buildings. A running record of every time the river decided it needs more space than it was given to begin with. But instead of abandoning the area, York adapted. It built flood defenses and raised the walkways, and architecture designed with all of that in mind, that the water will eventually show up uninvited. And that's more of a relationship than control, a little bit of negotiation with nature. The city builds, the river responds, and over time they reach something that almost works for both of them. Today, this is one of the most peaceful parts of York. There's walkways with trees and views of the city unfolding along the banks. No obvious signs that this is the same water that repeatedly caused chaos. Which is probably what makes it effective, because history here isn't loud, it's very subtle, it's layered into the landscape and just quietly doing what it's always done. So the River Ouse isn't just scenery, it's quite literally the reason York exists at all. A natural system that shaped trade, growth, and survival for nearly 2,000 years. And even now, it's still just quietly deciding how the city behaves. This is the Shambles, a medieval street that has been in continuous commercial use since at least the 11th century and was even recorded in the Domesday Book, which means it has been making money for nearly 1,000 years without ever needing a rebrand. Now, the name Shambles comes from the Old English word scrimmel, meaning bench, specifically a butcher's bench. So the entire street is quite literally named after the surface used to cut meat, which is a level of honesty modern marketing tends to avoid. In medieval records, it's referred to as the Great Flesh Shambles, where flesh simply meant meat, confirming that this was York's central butchery district, and that subtlety was not considered necessary in features of urban naming. Now, by the 14th century, around 20 to 25 butcher shops were operating here all at the same time, creating a dense, highly efficient system where animals were brought in alive, processed on site, and sold immediately, with absolutely no delay between production and consumption. Iron hooks were built directly into the timber frames of the building, many of which you can still see today. And these were used to hang carcasses out into the streets so that customers could inspect the quality or unintentionally become part of the inspection process themselves. You'll notice running down the center of the street was a drainage channel designed to carry away blood, fat, offal, and waste, using gravity as its primary technology, which meant the entire system was efficient, very visible, and shared by everyone whether they wanted to be involved or not. Medieval authorities did introduce some sanitation laws and fines for improper waste disposal, but records show that these were frequently ignored, suggesting that the demand for meat consistently outperformed the city's attempt to regulate it. Now, the buildings lean inward, not because they're about to collapse, but because upper floors were extended outward using a technique called jettying, which allowed for owners to increase the space above without increasing the taxable footprint, making this essentially an early form of architectural tax avoidance. Now, there is some debate on that if this happened in York, but there are records of this happening in other medieval cities, so the debate continues. Now, this overhang also reduced the amount of sunlight reaching the streets, which also lowered the temperatures and slightly, in theory, slowed the spoilage of the meat, meaning the entire street functioned as kind of a passive refrigeration system long before electricity made that much easier. At this time, York was one of the most important cities in England, effectively acting as the northern capital after London. A strong trade connections and religious influence centered on the York Minster, and a population that depended on streets like this for their daily survival. Now, butchers did operate under strict guild control, which regulated who could trade, how they traded, and what they could charge, meaning this wasn't as chaotic as you might think, but instead a tightly controlled system that ensured both quality and profit remained within a limited group. When the Black Death reached York in 1349, the city lost a large portion of its population, and while dense streets like these increased the spread of disease, the infrastructure itself remained in place and continued to function once the population stabilized. And you might wonder, was fire a constant risk due to the timber construction? Yes, open flames and the close space between buildings. But despite these conditions, the street avoided total destruction, which suggests a combination of maintenance, luck, and possibly the general reluctance to start fires near your own business. Now, the construction method helped with its survival, as oak provides a structural strength while the wall and daub panels could be replaced over time, allowing buildings to be repaired in sections rather than having to be demolished entirely. For several centuries, the function of the street remained largely unchanged, with butchery dominating the area and the layout continuing to support the same type of work that it was designed for. But this began to change in the 19th century with the introduction of public health reforms, which improved the sanitation and moved meat processing into more regulated slaughterhouses, making streets like this unsuitable for their original purpose. And as a result, the butchers left, but the buildings did not. And while many cities chose to demolish and rebuild similar areas, York largely left this one alone, partly due to the cost and partly because it was simply too complicated to modernize. What might have been neglect eventually became preservation, as attitudes shifted in the 20th century and the historical value of streets like this became widely recognized. The Shambles was then protected, maintained, and had its original plots, the street alignment, and building structures, making it one of the most complete examples of medieval streets still in use today. And inside the buildings, the layout remains consistent, with the shop at the front, the workspace behind, and the living quarters above, creating a vertical system where daily life and work were combined into a single structure. This meant families lived directly above their businesses, sharing spaces, resources, and conditions that would definitely not meet modern expectations, but were completely normal at the time. Over time, modern utilities like electricity and plumbing were added, though carefully fitted into the structure, and these structures were never designed to accommodate them. But this allowed the buildings to remain functional without losing their original form. Today, the street has shifted from production to consumption, with shops and tourism replacing butchery, but the underlying purpose of the space, to generate economic activity, is still the same today. And its appearance has led to frequent comparisons to the fictional streets like Diagon Alley, though in reality, this came first, meaning whatever looks like a fantasy was actually just practical medieval design that aged into something very distinctive. And it has been proven that Harry Potter did not use this to base Diagon Alley off, and that What's-Her-Face had never actually even been here. So, anywho. But movement through these streets is still controlled by its narrow structure, forcing people to slow down and navigate carefully, just as they would have done centuries ago when obstacles were slightly more organic. When you slow down, you begin to notice the details, the timber beams, the angles, the subtle distortions that come from centuries of use, all of which reflect the building's style and focus rather on function than precision. And this approach has remained durable, as structures built to simply work have continued to do so for far longer than many modern designs intended to be perfect. The street's survival is not a result of being frozen in time, but of adaptation continuously happening, allowing it to support different types of economic activity without losing its core structure. Now, this is what makes the Shambles less of a historical display and more of a working example of long-term urban continuity, where the same space has been used in different ways across multiple centuries. And rather than becoming obsolete, it simply has evolved, continuing to generate activity and value without needing to fundamentally change its design. And that's why it still works, because underneath everything modern, this is still a medieval street designed to support trade, which is exactly what it's been doing for 1,000 years. There are old buildings, and then there's the York Minster. Construction started in 1220 and finishes in 1472, roughly 250 years. Which means if you started working on this, you weren't the one that finished it, and neither did your children, and probably not their children either. Entire generations contributed to something they would never see completed, which makes this less of a building and more of a long time commitment. Right outside, there's a statue of Constantine the Great, declared emperor here in 306 AD, not in Rome, but in York, a major Roman military base. He later legalizes Christianity throughout the Roman Empire in 313 AD, which means this entire cathedral exists because something that happened in this very city. So this building doesn't just start in the Middle Ages, it actually begins with Rome. The first church here was in 627 AD, built for the baptism of King Edwin of Northumbria. It was wooden, temporary, and built very quickly, which is usually how things start. But what follows was not quick. Stone later replaced wood, and the structure got larger, the designs got more ambitious. Things were rebuilt, expanded, and reworked over and over again, until eventually this site stops being something practical and starts being something monumental. And when you walk in, the scale takes over immediately. The nave is from the 14th century. It's around 27 meters high and nearly 80 meters long. At the time, one of the largest Gothic spaces in Europe. Everything is vertical. The columns stretch upward, the arches point upward. The vault is pulling your eye upward. Because in Gothic architecture, the main objective was height. Clustered columns, grouped together, make this structure feel taller than it already is, and a ribbed vaulting distributes the weight through the stone ribs, down through the columns, and then outward through flying buttresses. So structurally, it's precise, but visually, it looks effortless. So this building is doing something very complicated while pretending it isn't. The stone is limestone, locally quarried and cut by hand and then moved manually, placed here without any machinery, which means everything you're looking at was physically built piece by piece. And then there's the light, the large windows, because in medieval theology, light represented divine presence. So the more light, the more impact. The building isn't just tall, it's designed to glow. And the stained glass is not just decoration, it's communication, because most people couldn't read. So this was the Bible in a visual storytelling with symbols and scenes and warnings. The glass was colored using metal oxides, such as cobalt for blue and copper for green, and then gold for red. It was painted, then fired and assembled, panel by panel. So instead of reading religion, you stood inside of it and absorbed it. Then you have the Great East Window, which was completed in 1408 and designed by John Thornton. It is the largest expanse of medieval stained glass in the world, with 300 panels, and is about 23 meters high. You might be surprised it was completed in only 3 years, which kind of raises questions about what everyone else was doing, since it shows the entire biblical timeline from creation at the bottom to the apocalypse at the top, beginning to end, stacked completely vertical. This place also survived the Reformation, when much of England's religious imagery was just destroyed. Then the Civil War. It was carefully dismantled panel by panel and hidden. It was protected and then reinstalled later. So this window has already survived history more than once. Then you have Chapter House. It is from the 13th century. It's octagonal with no central pier. The entire ceiling is supported by the walls and the vaulting. The weight is distributed outward, which requires very precise geometry. So everything you see above you is balanced, but not supported. It's used for meetings, the clergy gathered here to make very important decisions. So beneath this very ceiling, policy was made. And then the Minster has a couple fires. In 1829, arson, and 1840, another fire. And in 1984, lightning struck and destroyed the roof. This building isn't just from one time, it's from all of them, because each of those fires required repairs and sometimes updates. And beneath everything, you have remnants of Roman York. You have structures from the Saxons, and you even have evidence of the Vikings. Because this was a trade center, York was connected all across Europe. And then medieval York just builds on top of it. So nothing truly got replaced, it just got stacked on top of each other. And from above, you can see this logic. You see the rivers used for trade, and the walls surrounding the building for defense, and the streets still following medieval lines. But at the center, you have this. It's not just a church, it's a statement that's been dominating the skyline for over 700 years. Now we go to Barley Hall, which sounds like a pub, but it's not a pub. It's a 14th century townhouse that survived plague, war, neglect, and most impressively, being turned into offices in the 20th century without anyone noticing it was medieval, which is like having an inside castle and thinking it's a WeWork. Now what you're looking at here is Barley Hall in the 1800s, and it looks completely unremarkable, because at this point, nobody remembers what it is. This has gone from an elite medieval townhouse to just another building, chopped up, covered up, and absorbed into the city, which means for centuries, people walked past this every day completely unaware that they were ignoring a 14th century powerhouse. History didn't disappear, it just got really good at hiding. It was built around 1360 when England was still recovering from the Black Death, which wiped out roughly half of the population. And somehow, this still didn't reduce property prices. York at the time was England's second city. It was wealthy, powerful, and full of people who believed spices could fix anything, including death. Barley Hall was opened by the priors of Nostra Priory, meaning it was technically a church property, so yes, medieval monks were effectively the landlords. Nothing changes. They rented it out to high-status guests, visiting clergy, and people important enough to need a house, but not important enough to own one. At its peak, it was a statement property. Timber framed, multiple stories, right in the city. Prime real estate. The medieval version of location, location, location. Except your neighbors might be butchers, bakers, and someone throwing sewage out of a street window. And this is the Great Hall, the center of everything. Dining room, meeting room, status symbol, and occasionally the courtroom. If you had power, you showed it here. Long tables, high ceilings, a fire in the middle, smoke drifting through the roof like a medieval vape, I suppose. Now, meals were not quiet affairs, they were performances. Hierarchy was everything. The higher your status, the closer you sat to the Lord. The lower your status, the closer you sat to the door. It was a little cold and filled with existential dread. And the food, it was heavy. It was meat, bread, ale. Vegetables existed, but they were treated with a little suspicion. Forks were barely even a thing, so people just used knives in their hands, which explains a lot about medieval table manners, or lack of. Now here's the twist. By the 20th century, Barley Hall had basically vanished. Not physically, just culturally. It was swallowed into other buildings, chopped up into offices, plastered over, and forgotten. A 600-year-old house hiding in plain sight in the middle of York. It wasn't rediscovered until the 1980s. Historians took one look at this structure and realized this wasn't just old, this was pretty important. The restoration stripped back centuries of changes, removed the modern walls, and rebuilt the missing sections. It recreated the medieval layout using the surviving evidence and a little bit of educated guesswork, which is historians' code for, "We're pretty sure this is right." Now what you're seeing now is a careful reconstruction of a medieval elite home. Not a castle, not a palace, but the kind of place powerful people actually just lived day to day, which I think is somehow more interesting, because this is normal life, just 700 years ago. Upstairs you had private chambers, which meant slightly more wealth, slightly more privacy, and maybe slightly fewer smells. And remember, York at this point was a northern powerhouse. Trade routes, politics, religion, they all collided here. Houses like this weren't just homes, they were part of the machine that kept medieval England running. So Barley Hall isn't just old, it's evidence of wealth after plague, of church influence, and how people actually lived between the big headlined events like wars and kings having their heads fall off. And the strangest part, it survived everything, only to be nearly lost to office space, which feels like the most modern threat of all. And for a Barley Hall, I wouldn't recommend the bread. This is the York Castle Museum, which sounds educational because it very much is. But it's also built on something far less comforting, because before this was a museum, this was a prison. These sketches show the site when it was still part of York Castle. Back when this wasn't a place you were visiting, it was more of a place you were sent to. Connected directly to Cliffords Tower, this was part of a full medieval power complex. Fortifications above and imprisonment below, a complete system for control. York Castle itself dates back to the 11th century, built by the Normans after 1066, because when you conquer a country, you don't ask for directions, you just build a castle. And this site became one of the most important administrative and judicial centers in northern England, which is a formal way of saying this is where authority lived and where it punished people who ignored it. The prison here evolved over the centuries, and by the 18th century included a debtor's prison, which is exactly what it sounds like. If you owed money and couldn't pay, you were locked up, which made it significantly harder to earn money and pay that debt. A system with absolutely no flaws. And this was not rare. Thousands of people passed through places like this. Not violent criminals, but ordinary people. Just shopkeepers, traders, families, all caught in a system where debt was treated like a crime. Now, conditions vary depending on what you could afford, and which is kind of a theme you might be noticing. If you had money, even in prison, you could pay for better food, better space, and even small comforts. And if you didn't, you got the full experience. Overcrowding was common, disease obviously spread very easily, and survival often depended on less on your sentence and more on your circumstances. Public executions also took place here, because punishment wasn't just about justice, it was about visibility, to send a clear message to everyone else. So it was very public and very clear. And then something changes. In the 19th century, attitudes toward crime and punishment begin to shift. reluctantly and slowly, but noticeably. Prisons became more structured and more regulated, less about chaos and more about control, which sounds like progress until you realize it mostly just made everything more efficient. Eventually, this site transitions away from being an active prison and in the late 20th century becomes what you see now, a museum, which is a very British solution to history. If something is dark enough, you preserve it and you sell tickets. Inside, you get something completely different. Not the cells or not the punishment anymore, but a reconstruction of streets and shops and daily life here in York. Kirkgate, which is one of the most famous examples, they recreated an entire Victorian street based on real businesses that actually once existed in York, which means you're not just looking at the history, you're able to actually walk through it. Every single detail here is deliberate. Shop fronts, signs, even the goods in the windows, all designed to show how people lived, worked, and spent that money in a period that feels rather recent but isn't. And that contrast is kind of the point, because upstairs you had everyday life, and down here you had people losing everything. Same site, but with far different experiences. One's about consumption, and the other is about consequence. And it forces a slightly uncomfortable realization that systems that build wealth also build punishment. Trade, debt, law enforcement, they were all connected. You didn't get one without the other. And places like this sit right in the middle of that relationship. Even the architecture reflects this. It's very solid and controlled and designed to contain not just people, but their behavior. And while the museum softens it and explains it and gives you a contextualization of it, the core function of this place does not disappear. It just kind of becomes easier to look at, which is what makes this kind of effective, because you're not just told what happened, you move through it, from power to punishment and then to everyday life. And that's the real story here. Not just that York has history, but that everywhere has history. It's that in one location, you can see how a system works from top to bottom. Who had power, who enforced that power, and what happened if you fell on the wrong side of that power. Here it's all preserved, it's all reconstructed, and setting exactly where it all happened. And an interesting note that the museum guides told me, that all the gardens in the front of the castle museum were actually converted into vegetable gardens during World War II, as many gardens across the country were, to make sure that the food supply was able to be maintained. Feels like something they could do today and would be very, very useful, but I do like the tulips. They are very pretty, but I don't think the tulips are very edible. And in the back wall of the York Castle Museum, you still see one of the original walls to the fortress. This is the grave of Dick Turpin, one of England's most famous criminals, which is impressive considering he's been dead since 1739. Now, Turpin was a highwayman known for robbery and violence, generally not someone you'd want to meet on a quiet road at night. Yet, he ends up becoming kind of a legend, which is why modern versions look like no Fielding, stylish, chaotic, and slightly charming, which is not historically accurate at all. In reality, Turpin's story ends here in York, not with some dramatic shootout, but with an arrest, a trial, and an execution by hanging. And even the legend is partly fiction. A famous overnight ride to York, almost certainly made up later. So this just isn't a grave. This is where myth meets reality, and a violent criminal gets repackaged into something easier to remember. Cliffords Tower doesn't look like much at first. It's just sitting here, on a hill, slightly detached from everything around it. But it's what's left of York Castle. And for centuries, this was the center of power in northern England. Not symbolic power, but actual power. This starts in 1068, right after William the Conqueror takes England. The North resists repeatedly, so William builds a castle here. It's vast and it's functional, a Motte and Bailey style, which means an earth mound, a wooden tower, and a defensive perimeter. They're easy to build and easy to defend, but they're very difficult to ignore. Because this wasn't designed to impress people, it was designed to stop rebellion. And almost immediately, that is challenged. In 1069, a rebellion in the north, supported by Viking forces, York is attacked. The castle is damaged, possibly even destroyed, and William responds with the harrying of the north. A campaign so severe, entire areas are burned, crops are destroyed, populations reduced. Northern England was effectively reset. Then the castle was rebuilt stronger and more permanent. So this place didn't just start with conflict, it was built because of conflict. Then in 1190, one of the most significant events tied to this site happens. York's Jewish community, around 150 people, take refuge inside of the castle tower. Outside, a mob gathers. Tensions escalate, negotiations fail, and rather than being captured, many choose to take their own lives. The tower is then burned. So this isn't just a defensive structure. It is a place where fear, power, and violence all converged. And that moment is still remembered because it changes how this site is understood. It's not just a castle, but it's part of a more complicated history. But the tower you see here now, it wasn't that one. That one was wooden. This one is clearly stone. It was rebuilt in the 13th century under Henry III of England around 1245. And the design is unusual, you might notice. It's a quatrefoil, which means a four rounded section joined together. From above, it's almost like a clover shape, which is not very common in England. That is why it stands out immediately. So, even by medieval standards, this was not normal. And the stone changes everything. It's much more difficult to destroy, it's far more permanent, and of course, it's far more expensive. This isn't just a tower, it's a royal stronghold. The treasury was stored here, records were kept here, military controlled bases here, and at times it was effectively the administrative center for the North, which means decisions affecting the entire regions took place inside this structure. So when you think about it, this isn't just about architecture, this is also about governance. But over time, its role changes. Military importance declines. The need for control sure doesn't. So then it becomes a prison for criminals, debtors, and good old political prisoners were all held right here inside of this fortress. Because once a fortress stops defending territory, it starts holding people. These same walls, but with a far different purpose. Then, in 1684, an explosion, likely from gunpowder being stored inside. That tends to happen with gunpowder. The interior is completely destroyed, leaving only the outer shell, which is what you see today. So, this ruin that you see from the building now, it's not just from erosion and time, it's damage from that very moment of the explosion. Now, this is the largest surviving part of York Castle. Everything else, the outer walls, the additional buildings, they're all gone, or they've been repurposed, or they've simply been absorbed into the city. So, what you're looking at here now isn't the whole castle, but is the last piece of that castle. And then there's the mound. It's entirely artificial, built by the Normans. It's just earth piled up to create height, because height will give you visibility, and having visibility gives you a strong advantage. And from up here, you can see anything approaching, which matters very much when your entire job is about control. So the hill is not natural, it's all about strategy. And from the top, you see the city's structures: rivers, walls, streets, and just across, the York Minster. Because here, religion means power, both dominating the same skyline. So this is Clifford's Tower, a place built to control the population. It witnessed conflict, tragedy, and governance, and it's still here. But it's not just what's left of a castle, it's what's left of how power used to work. The Golden Fleece, dating back to the early 16th century. It's also known as one of the most haunted pubs in York, which is a competitive category here. Reports include footsteps, moving objects, and the general feeling that you're not totally alone. Inside, you'll also find death masks, actual casts taken from people's faces after they died. So, in between the ghost and history, the fact that you're drinking in a building that's over 500 years old, this is either a pub or a well lit reminder that people have been here before you. There are churches in York that make a statement, and then there's the Holy Trinity Church, which mostly avoids eye contact. It's set back slightly from the street, partially hidden, which means you can walk past it without even realize you just ignored something 900 years old. Parts of the church date back to the 12th century. There's Norman foundations, heavy stone. This place was built to last, and it has. It's lasted through plagues, wars, reformations, and entire shifts on how religion worked, which is impressive considering how much England likes to change things. But unlike most churches, this one didn't get heavily improved by the Victorians, which means what you're looking at here is closer to what medieval people actually saw. Not a polished version, just a version that kept going. And then we have the Peace Bell, installed in 2016 to mark the centenary of the end of the First World War. One of the newest things here is about remembering something from over 100 years ago, which feels appropriate. And then you go inside, and immediately everything changes. Because outside it looks quiet, but inside it feels old because it actually is old. You might notice the lower ceilings, the dim lighting, and the uneven floors because this place wasn't designed to impress you, but it was designed to be used. It was a local parish church, which means it had regular services. Everyday life took place here. Not grand events, but just routine. So instead of overwhelming you, this place surrounds you. And this was interesting, I noticed. These are box pews. They're from the 17th to the 19th century, and families would rent them on a yearly basis. And look at the surfaces. The wood's worn smooth, not polished or treated. It's just worn. Repeated contact, hands, sleeves, years of people leaning, setting, shifting around, maybe a little bored. The edges of the pews are rounded off, but not by design, simply by use. The stone under your feet is uneven, not because it was badly built, but because it's been walked on for centuries. Every step removing something so small you wouldn't even notice it until it's all added up together. And now the floor is not even flat, it's completely shaped by movement. So the building hasn't just survived people, it's been altered by them. It also stays cool in here due to the heat sink with all the surrounding stone, which is why I could see my breath in here. Nothing is untouched, nothing is static, because this place wasn't preserved and sealed off. Every week, people attended this building for services, for gatherings, for quiet moments. It was just a routine, not just major life events, but just regular life. So, what you're looking at isn't history at its most dramatic, similar to the Minster. It's history at its most consistent, which is why this place feels so different. Because at no point were buildings built to be reset. There was no clean break or redesign. There's no moment where it just started over again. This place was just maintained. Through centuries of change, it stayed the same. Religious shifts, social change, the entire city evolving around it. This place remained mostly untouched, which is rare because most places don't continue like this. They simply get replaced or rebuilt, or even sadly updated until they're unrecognizable. But this place, it just quietly and consistently carried on without needing attention. There were still tombs within the building of the people who used to walk these very stones, and there are even graves outside of the people who used to attend. You really may not notice this place as you're walking down the Shambles, but if you just sneak down one little alley, you can stumble on what feels truly like time travel. So this place is less about what what survived, but it's more about what never stopped. This place still exists, almost untouched. And it's locally maintained by donations, which I was happy to give. This church stood out to me out of all the things I saw in York, and perhaps because it does truly feel like a window in time, unlike any other place, and that it's not built to be grand, but it's simply what things would have just looked like. So if you stop in York and you find yourself wandering down the streets, I highly recommend you sneak off to this little church. If Barley Hall shows you how people lived, this is a place that shows you how people made money, and more importantly, how they controlled who else was allowed to make money. This is the Merchant Adventurers Hall, which sounds exciting, and it was, but it mostly involved paperwork, rules, and quietly dominating the economy. Built in 1357, this is one of the best preserved medieval guild halls in the world, And that matters because guilds were not just clubs, they were power structures. So if you wanted to trade in York, you didn't ask permission from the king, you asked these people. The merchant adventurers were an elite group of York's economy. They controlled trade far beyond the city walls, imports, exports, deals that actually made money. So if you were selling locally, you were just a different class entirely. These were one of the big thinkers of the time, like medieval globalists, basically. And memberships were not open. You didn't just get to sign up. You had to prove wealth, reputation, and connections, which is medieval for, if you're asking how to join, you're not getting in. This building reflects that status. Timber framed, elevated, and a bit imposing, sitting right above the street like it knows it's important, because it is. And this is where decisions were made that affected the entire city. In the Great Hall, the business of medieval capitalism, meetings, deals, disputes, all happening in one room under a roof held together by oak beams now older than most countries. Again, everything here was about hierarchy, where you sit, who speaks, who listens. Even the layout tells you who matters and who doesn't. It's not subtle, it's like medieval LinkedIn, but with actual consequences. And also, like Barley Hall, it wasn't just about comfort, it was about projection. You walk in here, you see wealth, order, and control. You understand immediately who is in charge. No branding needed. Now underneath all of this is the Undercroft, which sounds very spooky and dramatic, but it's mostly just storage. Goods, supplies, and occasionally people doing their work that made this whole place possible. Because power always sits right above labor, even architecturally. But this hall wasn't just about money, it was also about a charitable role. Members were expected to support the poor, fund hospitals, and contribute to their community, which sounds generous until you realize it also reinforced their control over said community. Because if you can control trade and you can control charity, you don't just run the economy, you run the city. Now, York in the 14th and 15th centuries was a major northern hub. Wool, cloth, various imports from Europe were all moving through networks like this, and the merchant adventurers sat right in the middle. They weren't explorers, despite the name. No one here is discovering a new continent. Adventurer at the time meant someone who risked capital. So really, they're just investors, but with better branding, I suppose. And like any powerful group, they had rules, strict ones. What you could trade, where you could trade, and who you could trade with. Break them, and you were not just fined, you were excluded. Which, in a system like this, that is basically economic exile. And the real power here, not the building, not even the wealth. It's control over access. Who gets in, who stays out, which is a theme that feels strangely familiar today. The hall has survived floods, fires, and the general chaos of English history, including a period where York stopped being the center of everything and became slightly less central. But unlike Barley Hall, this place was never completely lost. It stayed in use and was maintained. It had always been understood that it was important, because money tends to preserve its own history better than anything else. What you're walking through now is not just architecture, it's a system. A physical representation of how medieval cities organized power, wealth, and influence, long before modern corporations figured out how to do the same with glass buildings and mission statements. The strange part is how familiar it all feels. An exclusive membership, controlled markets, public charity tied to private power. That's not ancient, it's just earlier. So if Barley Hall was about living well in medieval York, this place is about deciding who was allowed to live well in the first place. And between the two, you start to see the full picture, not just of how people lived, but who made sure they lived that way. So far, you've seen how medieval York lived and how it made money. But now to go even further back, to when York wasn't even called York. It was Jorvik, or Jorvik, if you use the Anglican pronunciation or the Viking pronunciation. Either way, I'm gonna get in trouble in the comments here. Now, it definitely smelled significantly worse back then. And they found this in Coppergate during an excavation in the 1970s. And this changed everything, because instead of just finding ruins, they found preservation. Wood, leather, fabric, things that normally rot just didn't. Which means this isn't guesswork, this is evidence. It may be very damp and a little smelly evidence, but evidence nonetheless. Now, Vikings took control of York in 866, part of what's called the Great Heathen Army, which sounds dramatic because it very much was. They captured the city and renamed it Jorvik, gonna say both so to please everyone. And it turned it into one of the most important trading hubs in Europe. Now, this wasn't just raiding, this was a settlement. It had permanent streets and workshops, homes packed tightly together along the river, a fully functioning city, ran by people better known for showing up and just stealing things and then leaving, which makes this site very different on how much survived. Usually, archaeology gives you stone, maybe some pottery if you're lucky. Here, the ground was waterlogged with low oxygen, which is the perfect condition for preservation. So instead of fragments, you get everyday life. Shoes, combs, tools, and even that famous human waste, which tells you exactly what people ate, how they lived, and possibly why no one stood too close to each other for too long. Now, the Jorvik Viking Center reconstructs not kings or battles, but a street, a normal day, in a Viking city that was quietly running a major economy. Because this was all connected. Trade routes stretching across Scandinavia, Ireland, and mainland Europe. Amber from the Baltics, silk from the east, silver coins moving through hands that probably still had dirt under their nails. Now, this is the part that people forget about Vikings. They weren't just raiders. They were traders and craftsmen. They also were urban planners in a very muddy sort of way. And the layout here reflects that. Narrow plots, buildings fronting the street, work happening in the front and living going on in the back, which functionally is not very different from a modern high street, just with a little bit more livestock. The smells are even recreated here as well, because authenticity matters. There's fish, smoke, and waste, all carefully engineered so you can experience exactly what it was like and immediately be grateful for modern plumbing. And above all of this is the reminder that cities, they don't just disappear, they evolve. Because Roman York became Viking York, and because of that became medieval York, which is what you've been walking through this entire time. The same streets, the same footprint mostly, different people and different systems, but the same location doing the same thing. Power, trade, and survival. And the Coppergate dig didn't just uncover objects, it rewrote how we understand Viking life. Less myth and more reality. Less horned helmets and more very practical shoes. Because what you're seeing at this level of detail, you stop thinking of Vikings as characters, and you start seeing them as people, with routines, jobs, problems, just like today, and probably some complaints about the smells as well. Which brings everything you've seen so far into focus. The Barley Hall, the merchant adventurers, they didn't just appear out of nowhere. They built on top of this, layer after layer of the same city, just ran by different people. So it's not just a museum, it's a foundation. It's the version of York where the systems you've already seen were just beginning to take shape. And once you notice that, you stop seeing history in separate moments, and you start seeing it as a continuous city that never stopped working. This is the House of the Trembling Madness. Not the original one in the Shambles, but the Stonegate location because I messed up on my map when I was going places. Well, this one has slightly less medieval chaos, but it has the same commitment to alcohol. And the building still fits in the setting, and Stonegate is one of York's most historical streets. It runs straight toward the York Minster, which is useful because after enough drinks, you can just follow the giant cathedral home. Now, the name Trembling Madness sounds theatrical, but it isn't. It is an old term for alcohol withdrawal, which is significantly less fun than the branding suggests. Inside, it's packed with beers, spirits, and enough options to make decision-making progressively worse. A modern drinking culture that dropped directly in the streets that has been pulling people into centuries. If you walk through York long enough, eventually the city stops pretending to be modern and simply gives up, which is how you end up here. Welcome to the Museum Gardens, a peaceful green space today, but historically one of the most expensive real estate developments ever funded entirely by prayer. Because these ruins behind me are what remains of St. Mary's Abbey, one of the richest, most powerful monasteries in all of England. Which raises an important historical question. How do you go from wealthiest religious institution in the north to a very atmospheric picnic spot? Well, the Tudor problems happened. Long before this became a place where people drink takeaway coffees next to an 800-year-old masonry spot, this site was a Benedictine abbey founded in 1088, just after the Norman conquest. The Normans, having successfully conquered England, immediately did what all new rulers do. Built enormous stone buildings to prove they were in charge now. Castles, cathedrals, abbeys, basically medieval versions of posting under new management signs everywhere. St. Mary's Abbey quickly became one of the most influential monasteries in all of the country. At its peak, it owned vast lands across Yorkshire, it collected rents, it managed farms, and it controlled serious wealth. Monks here weren't just quietly praying all day. They were running a medieval corporate empire, only with fewer emails and slightly significant more chanting, unless you count the microdosers in San Francisco. Life inside the abbey followed a strict Benedictine rules. Prayer, study, work, reflection, which sounds peaceful until you realize the monks woke up around 2 a.m. for night prayers. So medieval spirituality involved a lot less enlightenment and a lot more sleep deprivation, which probably induced hallucinations, I guess. The museum gardens also contain the best preserved standing Roman ruins in York. That little red brick line, that's the original Roman legionary fortress wall. but they later did additions in the medieval times. But yeah, history right there. The Abbey church itself was enormous, larger than many cathedrals, decorated with stained glass, carvings, and enough symbolism to keep art historians employed indefinitely. Today, all that remains are these skeletal walls, open to the sky. A very open concept plan, you could say. For centuries, St. Mary's Abbey thrived, and then along came Henry VIII, a man best remembered for marital enthusiasm and administrative efficiency. In 1530, Henry decided England no longer needed monasteries, partly for religious reform and partly because monasteries owned an incredible amount of land and money. Historians call this the dissolution of the monasteries, and monasteries called it a very bad week. Royal commissioners arrived, assessed the abbey's wealth, and then shut it down. The monks were pensioned off, and the treasures were removed, and the building was stripped down to the stone, because nothing says religious transformation like recycling your abbey into building materials. Much of York and many other buildings across England quietly contain stones taken from dissolved monasteries, meaning parts of this abbey are probably still standing, just disguised as someone else's house. After the dissolution, the grand church slowly fell into the ruin you see today, and without maintenance, roofs collapsed, walls weakened, and nature moved in. Now grass grows where choirs once sang, and trees rooted themselves where incense once burned, and history doesn't just disappear, it kind of just changed landlords. And that's what makes this place oddly powerful. These ruins aren't preserved as a perfect monument, they're unfinished, open. A reminder that even institutions that feel permanent can vanish within a generation, which is comforting if you're worried about your inbox. The gardens themselves came much later, in the 19th century, when Victorians developed a passion for turning historical leftovers into respectable public spaces. And those same Victorians who invented seaside holidays and afternoon tea culture, and the idea that the ruins were romantic instead of inconvenient. They landscaped around the grounds, they planted trees, they transformed the former abbey into what became known as the Yorkshire Museum Gardens, essentially converting medieval power into Victorian leisure. And scattered around the gardens are layers of York's history stacked almost casually together. The Roman remains, the medieval walls, the Georgian science, the Victorian landscaping, all within walking distance of an ice cream van. So the museum gardens aren't just a park, they're a reminder that power fades, buildings fall, and meaning can change, but places endure. York is one of those places that quietly over-delivers. You show up expecting some history, but you get layers stacked on top of each other for nearly 2,000 years. Romans, Vikings, medieval power, all still here and not preserved behind glass, but just part of daily life. You walk past buildings older than your entire country on the way to just get a coffee, which either puts things into perspective or completely destroys it. And what you see here in a day is barely anything. There are streets that you miss and stories you don't hear. History just sitting here, continuing to wait for you to come back. And then there's this part, because places aren't just history, they're people, standing in a city this old, doing something very normal, having a pint, which might be the most consistent tradition here. What is your favorite place in York? Let me know in the comments below. And please like and subscribe and do that little hype thing. And special thanks to my members who make these trips possible. See you in the next one.